The door was ajar, the sound of running water echoing softly. I pushed it open slightly, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. Liam stood there, his back to me, his movements frantic. "Oh my God, I didn't hear you come in," he stammered, his voice shaky, panic written all over his face. I should have walked away, but something made me stay. We were an ordinary family, at least that's what it looked like from the outside. My husband Ethan and I had been married for 5 years. He was dependable, hardworking, and loving, though his job often kept him late. Our home was quiet, nestled in the suburbs, where routine defined our lives. Ethan's son, Liam, from his previous marriage, lived with us. Liam was 20, polite but reserved, with a habit of disappearing into his room for hours at a time. He worked part-time at the local hardware store and studied business at the community college. Though we weren't particularly close, I had always respected Liam's independence. He wasn't the type to seek attention or share much about his personal life. Our interactions were cordial. A polite "good morning" or "dinner's ready" were usually the extent of our conversations. It was the kind of relationship built on unspoken boundaries and mutual respect. Our life felt predictable, if a bit distant at times. Ethan had been buried under deadlines at work, and Liam's quiet demeanor often left me alone with my thoughts. I had always chalked it up to the natural distance that comes with being a step-parent. I never tried to push past his boundaries, letting him come to me if he ever needed to, which, frankly, he never did. That Wednesday evening started like any other. I had come home exhausted from work, the sound of my heels echoing through the empty house. Ethan had called earlier to say he'd be late, as usual. I didn't think much of it. Late meetings were nothing new for him. As I walked in, the house was eerily still. Liam's truck was parked in the driveway, which was odd. He usually worked evening shifts. Pouring myself a glass of water, I called out his name. No response. Shrugging it off, I assumed he was in his room, headphones on, lost in his own world. It wasn't until I climbed the stairs that I noticed the faint sound of running water. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, something that immediately struck me as strange. Liam was always meticulous about privacy. Curiosity got the better of me, and I hesitated, standing frozen in the hallway. I had no idea then that stepping closer would change everything. As I stood outside the slightly ajar bathroom door, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The faint sound of running water and the strange way the door wasn't fully shut. It wasn't like Liam. He was always so particular about his space, his privacy. Something about it felt off. I hesitated, unsure whether to simply walk away and give him his usual space, but curiosity gnawed at me. I gently pushed the door open just a little more, enough to peek inside. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Liam was standing by the sink, shirtless, his back turned to me. His shoulders were hunched, and his movements were frantic, almost as if he were scrubbing at something hidden from view. His jeans hung loosely at his hips, and his posture was tense. I froze, unsure of what to do or say. The creak of the door startled him. He spun around quickly, his face a mask of panic. "Oh my God, I didn't hear you come in," he exclaimed, his voice shaky. His eyes were wide, darting nervously between me and the door, as if he were cornered. I stammered. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." My face burned with embarrassment, and I quickly turned my gaze away. I felt as though I'd stumbled into a moment I wasn't meant to see, something intensely personal. I stepped back, my hand reaching for the doorknob, eager to retreat and give him the privacy he clearly wanted. But before I could close the door, his voice stopped me. "Wait," he said, almost pleading. "It's not what you think." There was a raw desperation in his voice that made me pause. His tone wasn't defensive or angry. It was something else entirely. Embarrassment, yes, but also vulnerability. Against my better judgment, I turned back to face him, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on his face. "Okay," I said cautiously. "What's going on?" Liam looked away, his cheeks flushed a deep red. He fidgeted with the washcloth in his hands, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, after a long, awkward silence, he let out a sigh. "I didn't know who else to ask," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ask about what? I pressed gently, trying to ignore the awkwardness of the situation. It's personal, he said, avoiding eye contact. I've just been dealing with something. Dad's not here, and you're the only person I could talk to. His words caught me off guard. Liam had always been so self-contained, so private. The idea that he would turn to me for help, not Ethan, not anyone else, was completely unexpected. I felt a strange mixture of discomfort and responsibility. All right, I said, stepping further into the bathroom and closing the door slightly behind me to give us some privacy. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Liam hesitated again, clearly wrestling with his emotions. When he finally spoke, his words came out haltingly. He described vague discomfort and confusion, stumbling over his sentences, as if he wasn't sure how to articulate what he was feeling. I listened carefully, piecing together his meaning. It didn't take long to realize that whatever he was dealing with, it was deeply personal and clearly something he felt too embarrassed to discuss with Ethan. First of all, I said after a moment of thought, it's good that you're paying attention to these things. It shows that you care about yourself. And second, there's no shame in asking for help. Liam looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and gratitude. Really? You don't think it's weird? Not at all, I assured him. Everyone has questions about themselves at some point. It's completely normal. As we talked, the initial tension began to fade. Liam seemed to relax, and I could tell he appreciated having someone to confide in. By the time we finished, he looked visibly calmer, and I felt a strange sense of relief as well. But even as I left the bathroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. The dynamic of our relationship had changed in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, and I wasn't sure what that meant. The days following that unexpected encounter were strange, to say the least. On the surface, everything seemed normal. Ethan carried on with his work schedule, often staying late to meet deadlines, while Liam returned to his usual routine of work and studying. But beneath the surface, there was a tension in the house that hadn't been there before. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from arguments or disagreements. It was quieter, more subtle, yet palpable. Every time Liam and I crossed paths, there was a hesitation in his voice, a flicker of something unspoken in his gaze. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But deep down, I couldn't deny that something had changed. One evening, about a week after the conversation in the bathroom, Ethan had left to meet a client for dinner. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I heard the sound of Liam's truck pulling into the driveway. I paused for a moment, unsure how to greet him. Our interactions had been polite but brief over the past few days, as if we were both avoiding lingering in the same space for too long. When he walked into the kitchen, his expression was unreadable. "Hey," he said quietly, opening the fridge to grab a bottle of water. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. "How was work?" "Busy," he said with a shrug, taking a long sip from the bottle. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Thanks for, the other night." I glanced up at him, surprised by the sudden acknowledgement. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'm glad I could help." There was a long pause, during which he seemed to be gathering his thoughts. I don't know. I feel like I can talk to you about stuff, Things I can't really talk to Dad about." His words caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. "Well," I said after a moment, "I'm always here if you need to talk." "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. He gave me a small smile, one that lingered just a little too long. I felt a strange flutter in my chest, an unwelcome, unsettling sensation that I quickly brushed aside. As the days went on, these small, fleeting moments became more frequent. A casual compliment from Liam, a brief touch on the arm as he passed me in the hallway, the way his eyes seemed to linger just a second longer than necessary. Each time, I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed early, I was sitting in the living room watching a movie. Liam walked in, his posture casual, but his eyes focused. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Not at all," I said, gesturing to the couch. He sat down, not too close, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence. We watched the movie in silence for a while, the tension between us growing with each passing moment. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the remote. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I pulled my hand back quickly, feeling my cheeks flush. "Sorry," I mumbled, trying to laugh it off. "It's okay," Liam said, his voice low. He didn't move his hand away, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The air between us was charged with an energy I couldn't quite define, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I stood up abruptly, pretending to stretch. "I should probably head to bed," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Long day tomorrow." "Right," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Disappointment, perhaps? "Good night." "Good night," I replied, hurrying out of the room before I could say or do anything I might regret. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. I felt a mix of emotions, confusion, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I tried to act as if everything was normal. I went about my usual routine, avoiding too much interaction with Liam. But every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, that unspoken tension was still there, lingering in the space between us like a shadow. It was as if we were both waiting for something to happen, though neither of us knew what that something was. And as much as I tried to deny it, I couldn't help but feel that the boundaries between us were beginning to blur in a way that terrified me. It was a Friday evening when everything came to a head. Ethan had gone out of town for a work conference, leaving Liam and me alone in the house. The quietness felt different this time, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I busied myself with chores, trying to ignore the unease that had settled over me since the encounter in the living room. Around 8 p.m., I heard Liam's footsteps coming down the stairs. He entered the kitchen where I was tidying up, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do all that now," he said casually, leaning against the counter. "You should relax." "I like keeping busy," I replied, forcing a smile. "Helps me unwind." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation, as though he was debating whether to say something. Finally, he spoke. "Do you want to watch something? I mean, if you're not too tired." I hesitated, my hands stilling on the dish I was drying. Part of me wanted to say no, to create some distance between us. But another part, the part that had been growing increasingly curious about the dynamic between us, said yes. "Sure," I said, setting the dish aside. "Let me finish up here first." We settled on the couch in the living room, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the walls. Liam had chosen a thriller, the kind of movie that demanded attention and left no room for small talk. Yet, as the movie played, I found myself acutely aware of his presence beside me, the way he shifted slightly closer as the minutes passed, the occasional brush of his arm against mine. At one point, a particularly suspenseful scene made me jump. I let out a startled laugh, trying to shake off the tension. Liam chuckled softly beside me. "You're too easy to scare," he teased. "Maybe," I admitted, smiling despite myself. But then, his hand brushed against mine, lingering for just a moment too long. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. Time seemed to slow, the sound of the movie fading into the background. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore, a depth of emotion that went beyond mere affection. It was vulnerable, intense, and utterly unexpected. "Liam," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't." "I know," he interrupted, his voice low and steady. "I know we shouldn't. But I can't pretend I don't feel something." His words hung in the air, heavy with implications. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, shock, confusion, and a strange, unwelcome sense of validation. I stood up abruptly, putting distance between us. "This is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "You're Ethan's son." "I know," he said again, standing as well. I know it's wrong, but that doesn't change how I feel. I shook my head, backing away toward the doorway. We can't do this. We can't even think about this. Before he could respond, I turned and fled to my room, shutting the door behind me. My heart was pounding, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. I felt ashamed, not just for the situation but for the part of me that hadn't immediately shut him down. For the rest of the night, I stayed in my room, avoiding any further interaction. But even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't escape the memory of the look in his eyes, or the way it had made me feel. The next morning, I resolved to put the incident behind us. I would set firm boundaries and make it clear that what had happened, or almost happened, was unacceptable. But when I stepped out of my room, I found Liam waiting for me in the kitchen. His expression was guarded, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his posture. I think we need to talk, he said. No, we don't, I replied firmly. We need to forget about last night and move on. It was a mistake. But it wasn't just last night, he said, his voice rising slightly. You know that as well as I do. Something's been building between us for weeks, and we've both felt it. His words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was written all over my face. I couldn't deny it, not to him, and not to myself. This is to stop, I said finally, my voice shaking. Whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong. It would destroy our family. Liam's expression softened, but the intensity in his eyes remained. I know, he said quietly, but I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either. I turned away, unable to face him any longer. Please, just give me some space, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, stepping back. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time, his voice sounded truly vulnerable. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. As he left the room, I felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. I knew he was right. Something had been building between us, and it had reached a point where we could no longer ignore it. But acknowledging it didn't make it any easier to navigate. For the rest of the weekend, we avoided each other as much as possible. When Ethan returned on Sunday evening, the house felt even quieter than usual, the unspoken tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. But as much as I wanted to pretend everything was normal, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days after Ethan returned felt like walking on eggshells. I kept myself busy, throwing every ounce of energy into mundane tasks, cooking, cleaning, errands. Anything to avoid the reality of what had transpired between Liam and me. I couldn't face it and I couldn't face him. Ethan, oblivious to the undercurrents in the house, continued his routine, his cheerful demeanor only making the tension more glaring to me. Liam, for his part, seemed to be keeping his distance. He spent most of his time in his room, or out of the house entirely. At dinner, he barely spoke, answering Ethan's questions with curt replies. Ethan chalked it up to the stress of school and work, but I could see it for what it was, avoidance. The silence between us was deafening. One evening, about a week later, Ethan suggested we all have dinner together at the dining table instead of in front of the TV. We haven't all sat down for a meal in ages, he said, setting down plates. Let's catch up. I forced a smile and nodded. Sounds like a good idea. Liam joined us reluctantly, his eyes fixed on his plate for most of the meal. Ethan tried to engage him in conversation, asking about work and his classes, but the responses were short, almost mechanical. Finally, Ethan turned to me with a joking smile. You two have been awfully quiet lately. Did I miss something while I was gone? I froze, the fork halfway in my mouth. Liam stiffened across the table, his eyes darting to me for a fraction of a second before looking away. No, I said quickly, too quickly. Just busy, I guess. Ethan chuckled, seemingly satisfied with the answer. But Liam stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Excuse me, he muttered, grabbing his plate and walking to the kitchen. Ethan raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, instead launching into a story about his day. I nodded along, pretending to listen, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't go on like this, living in a constant state of anxiety, waiting for the next crack to appear. Something had to give. Later that night, I found Liam sitting on the back porch, staring out into the darkness. I hesitated before stepping outside, unsure if I was ready for another confrontation. But I knew it couldn't be avoided forever. "Liam," I said softly, sitting down a few feet away from him. "We need to talk." He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know. I can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. The tension, the silence, that's not fair to anyone. Especially Ethan. He let out a bitter laugh.
Ethan. Right.
I don't think he'd even notice if the house burned down around him. "That's not fair," I said, though deep down, I understood his frustration. Ethan's work had taken a toll on their relationship, and I knew Liam felt neglected. But that didn't excuse what had happened between us. "He's doing his best." Liam turned to me then, his expression raw and unguarded. "And what about us?" he asked. "Are we just supposed to pretend nothing happened?" "Yes," I said firmly, though my voice cracked under the weight of the word. "We have to. What happened was a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. But it can't happen again." He looked at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched. "You say it's a mistake," he said quietly, "but you don't mean it." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood, wrapping my arms around myself as if that could shield me from the cold truth. "It doesn't matter what I feel," I said finally. "What matters is doing the right thing. For Ethan. For all of us." Liam didn't respond, and I took his silence as agreement. I walked back inside, leaving him alone on the porch. But even as I closed the door behind me, I knew the conversation was far from over. Over the next few weeks, life continued in a strained semblance of normalcy. Liam and I avoided being alone together as much as possible. When Ethan was home, we made an effort to act as though everything was fine, but the cracks in our facade were growing wider with each passing day. One evening, as I was folding laundry in my room, Ethan walked in, a concerned look on his face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. I hesitated, my hands stilling on the shirt I was folding. "What do you mean?"
"You and Liam," he said.
"You've both been acting off." I can't put my finger on it, but something's not right. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "You're imagining things. He's just busy with work and school." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "If there's something going on, I hope you'll tell me," he said softly. "We're a family. We're supposed to be in this together." His words sent a pang of guilt through me, and I felt the urge to confess everything. But I couldn't. The truth would destroy him, destroy us. So I smiled and said, "Of course. You'll be the first to know." But as he left the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lies we'd built our lives on were about to come crashing down. The weeks that followed were an exercise in restraint. I did everything I could to maintain the fragile balance in our household. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, and I clung to the hope that if I pretended hard enough, things might return to normal. Liam, however, was harder to read. His interactions with me were guarded, careful. He seemed to be trying, in his own way, to respect the boundaries I had set. But there was still an undercurrent of tension, a silent acknowledgement that neither of us could ignore. One evening, Ethan suggested we take a weekend trip to the lake as a family. "It'll be good for all of us," he said. "We've been so caught up in our own worlds lately, it's time we reconnected." I hesitated, unsure if spending more time together would ease the tension or make it worse. But Liam surprised me by agreeing almost immediately. "Yeah, that sounds nice," he said, his voice unusually earnest. The lake was beautiful, a serene escape from the chaos of everyday life. We spent the day swimming, playing frisbee, and sharing stories by the water. For the first time in weeks, I saw Liam smile, really smile, and it felt like a weight had been lifted. Even Ethan seemed more present, laughing and joking in a way that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with. As the sun began to set, we sat together on the shore, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. Ethan had dozed off on a blanket, his soft snores blending with the gentle lapping of the waves. Liam and I sat a few feet apart, the silence between us no longer heavy, but companionable. "Thanks for coming," he said after a long pause. I didn't realize how much I needed this. I glanced at him, his face softened by the golden light of the setting sun. "It's been nice," I admitted. "Maybe we needed this more than we realized." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said quietly, "about everything that's happened." I tensed, unsure of where this conversation was going, but he continued before I could respond. "I think I've been holding on to things I shouldn't. Feelings, expectations, stuff that's not fair to you. Or to Dad." His words took me by surprise. "Liam." "No, let me finish," he said, turning to look at me. "I know I've crossed lines I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry. I don't want to make things harder for you. Or for Dad. I guess I've been feeling lost, and you were there when I needed someone." I swallowed hard, his sincerity cutting through the defenses I'd built around myself. "It's okay to feel lost," I said softly. "We all do sometimes. But you're stronger than you think, Liam. And you have people who care about you, who want to help you." He smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with unspoken emotions. "Thanks," he said, "for everything. Even when I didn't deserve it." The weight of his words settled over me, but for the first time, it didn't feel unbearable. It felt like closure, a step toward healing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized that while our journey as a family had been messy and imperfect, it wasn't irreparable. When we returned home, things began to shift. Liam and Ethan spent more time together, strengthening their bond in ways that had been missing for years. I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Ethan, making an effort to be present and honest in ways I hadn't been before. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but we were moving forward. Looking back, I realized that the experience, painful as it had been, had taught me valuable lessons about boundaries, about forgiveness, and about the importance of facing uncomfortable truths. Life is messy, and relationships are complicated, but it's in those moments of struggle that we find the strength to grow. In the end, I chose to see it as a second chance, not just for me, but for all of us. A chance to rebuild, to reconnect, and to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. What would you do in this situation? Have you ever experienced moments in life where boundaries were tested and choices became complicated? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories that explore the complexities of human relationships. Stay tuned. Our next story will leave you speechless.